What's up, backers? Brooklyn here. In this video, we're going to go over how to play encounters and kill stuff. And just as a reminder, this and the two previous videos are the only 3 videos that new players who aren't running the game will need to watch to get playing. Oh, and also, the rules for playing encounters is the same regardless of if you're playing the crawl mode or the adventure mode. Okay, so let's get right into it. Setting up encounters is broken into 4 phases: the prepare phase, the placement phase, the distribution phase, and the initiative phase. The prepare phase is the phase that adventurers get to heal, remove negative tokens, and otherwise gain a myriad of mechanical benefits before starting an encounter. If this is your first encounter of the crawl mode or the adventure mode, you'll likely not benefit from any of the things this phase does for you. But to go over them briefly, first, each adventurer removes their used tokens from their per encounter abilities. Then, all adventurers with damage are healed until they have damage equal to half their total HP value. This includes defeated adventurers, meaning that between encounters, adventurers will return to the board with half of their total HP remaining. Then, all effect tokens are removed. This means that any lingering effects, like poison, are removed. This ensures that any positive or negative effects won't carry over between encounters. Then, each adventurer sets their current stamina points to their stamina point recovery value. That's going to be the little red spheres printed on the adventurer card right here. This will usually be 3. 2 important things to note about this phase. First, there's a special token in the game called ability tokens. These tokens are not removed during this phase. In fact, these tokens are never removed until they are used or adventurers are told to restore via an adventure mechanic in the adventure book or crawl book. Next up is the placement phase. Using the depicted encounter setup page, players will construct the encounter on the table. After the board and all the depicted figures and tokens are all set up, each player will place their adventurer figure on any space in the listed start zone. Cool, so far so good. Now that the board and all figures are set up, you'll move on to the distribution phase. During the distribution phase, players need to find all of the command and intelligent combatant cards being used in the encounter and pass them out evenly among all the players. This way, each player will have a responsibility when it's not their turn. Next up is the initiative phase. During the initiative phase, we basically get to build ourselves an initiative track. The initiative track is set up on any edge of the board and will determine the order in which figures take turns. To set up the initiative track, take an initiative card for each corresponding figure depicted in the encounter, including the adventurer figures that were just placed. Then, shuffle the cards and deal them out one at a time to create a row of cards. This is now considered the initiative track. Starting from the front of the initiative track, figures will take turns one at a time. Once every figure on the track has taken a turn, the round ends and a new round begins starting at the front of the initiative track. This method of taking turns continues until an end condition listed in the corresponding encounter is reached. Finally, the best voice actor in your gaming group reads the flavor text of the encounter, followed by the special encounter rules aloud. We also recommend double-checking how objective tokens might activate at this time. Okay, great. Now we're ready to get started. First, let's talk about how to take turns as an adventurer. When an adventurer's turn begins on the initiative track, they go through the following phases: start of turn phase, status phase, refresh phase, action phase, and finally, the end of turn phase. When starting an adventurer's turn, the adventurer must go through the start of turn phase first. During this phase, any abilities controlled by the current adventurer that have a text condition that says they happen during the start of their turn will occur. Next, an adventurer will go through the status phase. During this phase, any abilities controlled by the current adventurer that have the condition tag status will occur. The status condition tag is not optional and will occur during every status phase. Some examples of the status condition tag are the negative effect poison and the discipline Nirvana's mark. Poison has its rule printed directly on its token, and it will deal irreducible damage equal to half of a figure's remaining HP during their status phase, while Nirvana's mark is a discipline that will heal the controlling adventurer 1 during every status phase. Next up is the refresh phase. During this phase, an adventurer gains stamina points equal to the red orbs on their adventurer card. This is called the stamina point recovery value, and will usually be 3 stamina points. In addition to gaining stamina points equal to their stamina point recovery value, an adventurer will unexhaust all of their cards currently exhausted and conclude the refresh phase. However, before we move on, let's talk about some important things about this phase. First, an adventurer may not gain more stamina points than they have total orbs printed on their adventurer card. This will usually be 5. So if an adventurer already had 4 stamina points at the start of their turn, they'd only gain 1 stamina point during this phase. Second, an adventurer doesn't gain stamina points on their first turn of an encounter. This is due to the fact that when setting up an encounter, an adventurer will usually already have been given 3 stamina points. Alright, let's move on. So next up is the action phase. During this phase, an adventurer will be able to spend stamina points to make actions and use abilities. In Middara, there are a list of standard actions and abilities that any adventurer may use. We've included quick reference cards that detail each of these so that the players can quickly reference them as they're learning to play. The standard actions in Middara are move, attack, encounter action, and re-equip. To make a move action, an adventurer must spend 1 stamina point. By doing so, an adventurer gains movement points equal to the movement value printed on their adventurer card. In most cases, this will be 6. These points may be spent to move your character. 1 point moves you 1 space. So to move, you'd simply count out the amount of spaces you'd like to move. So for example, if Nightingale wanted to move to get adjacent to the cave sickle in this diagram, she'd have to spend 6 movement points to move 6 spaces forward. Simple enough. However, the finer details of movement is what you need to pay attention to. There are 8 rules you need to keep in mind when moving. 1. An adventurer may never take more than 1 move action in a turn. 2. An adventurer may never move diagonally. Instead, they must move orthogonally, meaning they must move up, down, left, right, as depicted here. 3. There are different types of terrain in Middara that can affect how many points of movement it takes to move out of their spaces. While there is a full list of terrain types in the rulebook, for now, we'll just mention an example. Hindering terrain is a type of terrain that is bordered in green. This type of terrain represents briar patches, thick bushes, and other hard-to-navigate terrain. Hindering terrain increases an adventurer's cost to move out of the space by 1. 4. While you may move through friendly figures, you may never end your turn on their space. Moving out of a space that contains a friendly figure costs 1 additional movement point, just like hindering terrain. However, this movement penalty does not stack, meaning that you will not have to spend an extra point to move out of hindering terrain that also contains an ally. 5. You may not break up your movement. One of our golden rules in Middara is that you cannot start a new action without ending the current action. This means that you cannot move 3 spaces, make an attack action, and then move 3 more spaces. 6. Some abilities will grant free movement. This movement does not count as a move action and will simply move your figures an amount of spaces listed on the ability. This movement ignores the negative effects on movement caused by terrain. So, for example, if Zeke in this diagram was to use Like the Shadows, a discipline that allows you to move 2 spaces, he'd be able to simply move 2 spaces, even though he's in hindering terrain. Something to note, free movement may only be used before or after a move action, not during. 7. Moving out of a space adjacent to an opponent will grant them a free attack against you. We call these free attacks break attacks. 8. While you may only take 1 move action a turn, there are still ways to move further during a move action. When making a move action, a figure may spend as many additional stamina points as they'd like. For each stamina point they spend, they may add +2 to their total movement points for that move action. Cool. So with all that in mind, let's show you a more involved example of the move action. Let's say that Zeke wants to move to open the chest on the far side of the same example we showed before. He'd normally have to spend 4 movement points just to get out of the hindering terrain. Then, he'd have to spend an additional 10 to reach the chest. This means he needs to spend a total of 14 movement points to reach the chest. However, Zeke only has the 3 stamina points. Fortunately, Zeke has the discipline Like the Shadows. This discipline would allow him to move 2 spaces for free, letting him move out of the hindering terrain before he's even taken a move action. Then, he'd spend 1 stamina point to make a move action and move 6 spaces. To move the last 4 spaces required to get to the chest, Zeke would spend his last 2 stamina points to add +4 movement and end his turn adjacent to the chest. Next turn, Zeke's going to be able to get himself some loot. The next standard action we want to talk about is the attack action. For 2 stamina points, an adventurer may make an attack action. The attack action has its own steps listed in the rulebook. Let's go over making an attack action in Middara. First, the player chooses a target. When choosing a target, they must be within line of sight and range of the weapon the adventurer is using. Line of sight in Middara represents whether or not your figure can actually see the target. To determine if a figure is within line of sight, simply draw an imaginary line from the center of one figure to the center of the figure they are trying to target. So long as this imaginary line does not cross paths with any obstructing terrain or goes through the space occupied by an opposing figure, the target is within line of sight. In this example, you can see that Nightingale has line of sight to 2 of the 4 potential targets. Since you can draw line of sight through friendly figures, Remy won't block her line of sight. However, 2 of her potential targets are blocked. One, due to it being behind another opposing figure, and another because it's behind obstructing terrain. When counting range in Middara, you may count diagonally. This means that all 9 spaces adjacent to a figure are considered adjacent and can be attacked at a range of 1. Next, an adventurer will build their combat dice pool by taking the listed dice on their equipped weapon. Once their dice pool is built, an adventurer may choose to empower their attack by spending 1 additional stamina point to add the black dice to the pool, making the total dice roll 3. Adding this black die to your pool is a great way to get additional symbols that can be spent to add damage or other bonuses to your attack. However, if the skull is ever rolled on this black die, the attack action automatically misses. After an adventurer decides if they want to empower or not, they'll determine if the target of the attack will dodge. Before rolling to attack, targets in Middara will always have an opportunity to dodge. However, unless they say otherwise, monsters and other antagonists will never dodge. So assuming the adventurer hit, they'll go to the determine damage step of the attack action. During this step, an adventurer calculates damage by first determining the difference by which the attack hit. For each number above the target's defense value the adventurer rolled, they add +1 physical damage to the attack. Next, an adventurer gets an opportunity to add damage using symbol abilities printed on cards they control, like their weapons for example. Then, the target subtracts the total incoming damage by their armor value. In Middara, armor is always damage reduction, so every point counts. Then, finally, we deal damage equal to the total damage left over after armor. For each damage dealt, the adventurer will put damage tokens on the target. If any figure ever has damage equal to their total HP, it is defeated and removed from the table. Alright, so there's a step in the attack action that basically just ends the attack. This step also serves as a reminder that the final step of an attack only occurs if an attack wasn't countered and didn't miss. So, assuming this attack didn't miss and wasn't countered, you'd move on to the final step of an attack action. The final step of an attack is called the Use Follow-Up Abilities step. Follow-up abilities are abbreviated FU on cards and are powerful abilities that can do a myriad of fantastic things. A very important note about this step: so long as the follow-up ability doesn't start a new action, an adventurer may use as many of them as they'd like. This means that if you had the Subterfuge Discipline Paralyzing Point and a Romstead Guard's Poleaxe, you could use both of their follow-up abilities on a single target, paralyzing them and also sending them crashing to the ground behind you for extra damage. Oh, and one more thing, you may only use follow-up abilities on the target of the initial attack. This means that you couldn't paralyze and toss another creature nearby. It has to be the one that you made the attack against. Let's take a look at the attack action in an example. Revisiting Nightingale, she previously moved 6 spaces towards the Cave Sickle using a move action for 1 stamina point. Now she wants to make an attack against the Cave Sickle for another 2 stamina points. Nightingale rolls her combat dice. Her weapons are a longsword and a magic talisman. Normally this would be a white and purple combat dice, but since the magic talisman has the light tag and the longsword has finesse, she gets to use the orange combat dice instead of the white combat dice. During the Empower step, Nightingale is subjected to the Magic Talisman's passive ability that says that when making an attack, that she empowers the attack, so there's really no choice for her there, but she also doesn't have to spend the extra 1 stamina point to empower the attack, so it's a double-edged sword. Nightingale rolls all 3 combat dice and rolls a 4 and a 5 and 4 shields on the black die. Adding the 2 combat dice together, Nightingale's total attack roll is a 9. If she had any abilities that added to her attack rolls, she could do that now, but she doesn't. Nightingale isn't concerned though. The Cave Sickle only has a defense of 8, meaning that Nightingale hit it regardless. Next, Nightingale determines damage. The difference she hit by is 1. Then, she adds damage using symbols. The total symbols she rolled are 2 books and 5 shields. Looking at her longsword and magic talisman, we can see that they both have symbol abilities that add damage. The longsword gives her 2 physical damage for every 2 shields she spends, so Nightingale spends 4 shields and adds 4 physical damage. Then, the magic talisman gives her another 1 magic damage for every 2 books she spends. So, Nightingale decides to spend 2 books to add 1 damage. The leftover shield cannot be spent, so it is discarded. Nightingale's total damage being added from symbols is now 5. Plus the difference hit of 1 is a total of 6 incoming damage. Unfortunately for the Cave Sickle, he doesn't have any armor, so the final damage dealt isn't reduced by anything and remains 6. The Cave Sickle only has 6 HP, meaning that he's cut down in a single attack and the figure is removed from the board. Okay, let's go over some finer details about attacking. First, regardless of if it's an adventurer or another combatant, the steps a figure goes through in making an attack are always the same. And while most monsters and antagonists will not dodge, dodging is a fairly normal occurrence for adventurers. When an adventurer is being attacked, they may spend 1 stamina point to dodge. When dodging, an adventurer simply rolls the black die and adds temporary defense equal to the amount of shields rolled. This means that dodging can add up to 4 additional defense. Since the defense you're hit by equates to damage, dodging will not only reduce your chance of being hit, but also decrease the damage you take even if you only roll a single shield. Second, a figure who misses with an attack or hits but deals no final damage, meaning it was reduced to 0 by armor or some other form of damage reduction, can be countered. While most monsters and bad guys won't ever counter, adventurers may spend 2 stamina points to counter. Or, more typically, an adventurer will counter during this step for free using an ability printed on weapons or disciplines. To counter, a figure must also check to make sure the target is both within line of sight and within range of their equipped weapons. After all, you can't counter if you couldn't normally attack them. Assuming all these conditions are met, the current attack action immediately ends and the figure countering gets to make an attack against the figure that originally attacked them. After this attack concludes, the initial figure who attacked may resume their turn, assuming they're still alive. Phew, okay, cool. So that's the attack action. Let's go over the next standard action that any adventurer can make, the encounter action. This action costs 1 stamina point and is used to interact with various items on the board. This can be opening chests or activating objective tokens that specifically instruct players that it can be activated using the encounter action. For example, if Zeke actually wanted to open the chest from the previous example given, he'd need to come up with 1 additional stamina point to make an encounter action. Luckily for him, he also has a consumable called MF Fortitude. This carbonated potion has a discard condition that will give him 1 additional stamina point and allow him to make an encounter action. Zeke downs the potion to gain 1 stamina point, makes the encounter action, and flips the loot token over to find the color of the chest. Then, Zeke reads the corresponding colored loot section in the current encounter to find out what he found. The last standard action adventurers can make is the re-equip action. This action is used to swap out what weapons, relics, or other items you have equipped with other items in your pack. In Middara, you have a pack size of 3. This represents your inventory space of non-equipped items. As the game progresses, certain builds will likely use this more than others. A good example of using the pack is when an adventurer wants to have a ranged weapon and a melee weapon available to them. The re-equip action is also used to take items from other adventurers who are adjacent to you. However, you may never give items to adjacent adventurers. Okay, cool. So, some special notes about the re-equip action. Any items you move around stay in their current state. So if they're exhausted or if they have a per encounter ability that has already been used, they'll stay exhausted or stay used even after you move them. Lastly, adventurers who gain items for any reason may immediately take a free re-equip action, meaning if you take a sweet weapon from your buddy or you find something awesome in a chest, you'll be able to immediately equip it. So that does it for standard actions and abilities. However, while we're on the topic, let's cover another important action that adventurers might want to perform: casting spells. Now, it's important to mention that casting spells isn't a standard action in Middara, meaning that you cannot normally do it. Instead, only adventurers using an ability that specifically says to cast a spell can perform the spell action. An example of this is the discipline Gore Shot. Gore Shot looks like this. If an adventurer uses an ability that instructs them to cast a spell, they go through a set of steps that are different from making an attack. While similar, there are some important differences. Let's take a look. First, an adventurer must choose a target. Just like making attacks, spells must target figures within range. However, the range of all spells is the same regardless of your equipment. In Middara, spells may target any figure within their sphere of influence. We abbreviate this on a lot of cards as SOI. A figure's sphere of influence is always 4 spaces in any direction, including diagonally. Okay, once an adventurer selects a target within their SOI, the next step is to determine the force of the spell. To determine the force of a spell, the adventurer would roll their casting die. Now, a figure's casting die is printed on their adventurer card. This is the casting die they use when they have no other item equipped that augments their casting die. However, if you're casting spells, we highly recommend grabbing yourself a wand or a grimoire or something that upgrades this die. But I digress. To determine the force of a spell, the adventurer will roll their casting die and add it to the listed force on the spell they're casting. In the case of Gore Shot, this is 6, meaning if you roll a purple die and got a 5, the force of the spell would be 10. Now, just like attacking, before rolling this die, an adventurer may choose to empower the spell by spending 1 stamina point and adding a black die to the roll. Unlike attacking, however, the black die in this case will only do one of 2 things. It will either add +1 force for each book you roll, or it will end your action and deal you 3 damage if you roll a skull. Oh, and as a final note about empowering, just like attacking, monsters and other antagonists will never empower a spell unless instructed to do so. Okay, so after you've determined the force of the spell, the target must try and make a conviction check to resist the spell. In this example, the force of Gore Shot is 10. A bad guy's conviction die will always be printed on its intelligent combatant card. So, let's say we were casting Gore Shot against a Cave Sickle. The Cave Sickle's card has a conviction of 2 purple dice. This means that the Cave Sickle would roll its 2 die and add them together. If the Cave Sickle rolls equal to or higher than 10, the spell is resisted and the spell action immediately ends. Otherwise, the Cave Sickle is going to get a face full of gore. So, let's assume he rolls a 9 and gets wrecked. This means that the spell's listed effect triggers. In this case, Gore Shot says to deal 2 magical damage. Then, you may take 1 irreducible damage to deal additional magic damage equal to your highest level Cruor discipline. Assuming Gore Shot was your only Cruor discipline, this extra damage you could deal would only be 1 additional damage for a total of 3. However, if you had a level 4 Cruor discipline, you'd deal 6 damage instead and outright kill the Cave Sickle. Regardless, after dealing the damage, you'd put damage tokens on the target and conclude the spell action. Some important notes about spells. First, you'll notice that I mentioned damage types. Magic damage, irreducible damage, physical damage, etc. In Middara, there are different damage types. In most cases, the types of damage being dealt is just physical damage and has no special properties. However, magic damage is a special damage type that cannot be reduced by armor. So while Gore Shot doesn't do a ton of damage, the damage it does do circumvents armor. Plus, it only costs 1 to cast, meaning you could cast it plenty of times in a single turn. Anyway, so moving on. The last thing on the subject of spells we wanted to touch on is spell-like abilities. Many abilities have Force X printed on them. These are called spell-like abilities. Whenever an adventurer uses an ability or follow-up ability that has Force X listed, they'll go through similar steps as casting a spell, However, a notable difference is that the force of the spell is printed on the card, so casting dice won't be added to its force. In addition, some spell-like abilities might augment the force based on other parameters. For example, the Great Hammer has a follow-up ability that will move an opponent that you just hit. Its force is augmented by the difference in which the attack actually hit by, so if you slammed a monster hard enough, they'd have a hell of a time beating the force value with a conviction check. Wow, alright, so that's a brief overview of what an adventurer's turn looks like. Let's take a brief look at command combatants. Command combatants represent friendly figures who will be controlled by the players and fight on their side. This is an example of a command combatant card. You'll notice that command combatants share some information with adventurers. In the top right corner, you'll find their stamina recovery bar and any special tags associated with them. Command combatants have all of their special abilities and equipment thematically wrapped up into a single card, meaning they don't have items, equipment, or discipline cards that they learn. Instead, everything they can do beyond the standard actions and abilities already mentioned are printed directly on their cards. So, when a command combatant's turn comes up on the initiative track, they'll go through all the exact same steps as an adventurer. Other than the fact they can't have items or discipline cards, they are considered allies to the adventurers in every way and follow all the same rules as adventurers. The next type of turn that will come up on the initiative track is intelligent combatants. These cards represent all the baddies in our game: evil minions, horrific monsters, and cunning villains. Intelligent combatants are like command combatants in that they don't have equipment or discipline cards. Instead, all of their rules are wrapped up into their single card. While the steps an intelligent combatant goes through are very similar to an adventurer or a command combatant, there are some very important differences. Let's go through the phases of an intelligent combatant's turn. First, just like adventurers and command combatants, intelligent combatants have a start of turn phase followed by a status phase. The rules for both of these phases are identical to their adventurer and command combatant counterparts. The third phase of an intelligent combatant's turn is where things start to differ. The third phase is the activation phase. During this phase, an intelligent combatant will act according to its AI steps printed on its card. Starting from the top of the list and moving down, the player controlling the intelligent combatant will go through each AI step, checking to see if the bolded condition is true. If it is not, the player continues down to the next bolded condition. A player continues in this fashion until a condition is true. Then, the combatant will follow the instructions listed beneath the true condition. After following the listed instructions on an AI step, a player then checks to see if an AI step instructs them to continue down. If so, the combatant will continue down until they find the next AI step with a true condition. If there are no true AI steps, an intelligent combatant will do nothing. The last phase of an intelligent combatant goes through is an end turn phase, just like an adventurer or command combatant. So let's see an intelligent combatant's turn in an example. After Zeke opens the chest and Nightingale kills the Cavesicle, let's say that the Earth Loa starts his turn. The Earth Loa isn't affected by anything at the start of its turn, and it also has no abilities affecting it during the status phase either, so the next step would be the activation phase. The Earth Loa's first AI step is there an ally with an SOI without barrier? There happens to be an animate within 4 spaces, so the Earth Loa's first AI step is true. The Earth Loa places barrier on the animate. This is a positive status effect that passively gives the animate 1 additional armor. Since the Earth Loa is instructed to continue down, he looks for the next true AI step. The next AI step says, is there more than 1 opponent adjacent? Since nobody is adjacent to the Earth Loa, the answer is no, so the player controlling him would continue to the next bolded AI step. It says, can it move and attack an opponent within reach 2? Looking at the movement value on the Earth Loa, the player is able to determine that the Earth Loa could move 4 spaces and attack Zeke within reach 2. The Earth Loa then moves up and makes an attack following all of the same attack steps as an adventurer. Afterwards, the Earth Loa would check to see if it continues down. Since it does not, the Earth Loa would continue to its end of turn phase and end its turn. Okay, let's go over some finer details about intelligent combatants. First, you'll notice that they have their symbol abilities, combat dice, conviction dice, and casting die, and all related important information printed directly on their cards, just like command combatants. But the information that might seem out of place is some of the tags, the colored boxes across the top, and the passive section. Let's go over these. The tags in the top right are detailed in the rulebook. On every intelligent combatant, you'll always find a DR value. The DR value is simply a difficulty rating that is used to give a general idea of how hard the monster is and nothing else. This can help you if you ever decide to make your own stories or encounters using the Middara system. While we're here, let's go over some important tags you might see on intelligent combatants. Avarice X. This tag means that when this combatant is killed, it will drop additional combatant cards equal to the X value listed. Boss. This tag means that the intelligent combatant represents a particularly strong opponent. Players will fight these combatants during special encounters throughout both the adventure mode and crawl mode. Boss combatant cards are located in the hidden card deck. The only special rules associated with this card is that if the monster loot card is drawn when killing a boss, you simply redraw. Gilded. These monsters always give their monster loot instead of a combatant loot card. Trivial. When a trivial combatant is defeated, no combatant loot is drawn. Swarm. Swarm monsters are a common monster type. When a swarm combatant is defeated, no combatant loot card is drawn unless it was the last combatant of its kind in a group. Let's talk about this a little bit more in depth right now since it bleeds into our second topic. The colored boxes printed across the top of intelligent combatant cards are called activation numbers. Activation numbers are used to keep track of multiple figures on the game board. There are 6 corresponding colored base snaps that players will use to keep track of different figures of the same type on the game board. When setting up an encounter, every figure will have a number associated with them. This number dictates which colored figure should be where on the game board. This way, players can know which cave sickle, for example, has damage, effects, or any other tokens and special rules associated with it. A special note, and to make the previously mentioned swarm tag make more sense, intelligent combatant cards might have more than one card printed with different activation numbers. We call these groups. For example, the Cave Sickle Intelligent Combatant card actually has 2 different cards, each with different sets of Cave Sickles they represent. Cave Sickle 1 through 3 is a group, while Cave Sickle 4 through 6 is another group. In fact, these groups even have their own initiative cards associated with them, meaning they'll activate at different times. Since the Cave Sickles also have the Swarm tag, players would have to defeat the last Cave Sickle in a group to gain the combatant loot card. One last note about activation numbers. These numbers also represent the order in which multiple intelligent combatants of the same type will take their turn. So when the Cave Sickle group starts their turn, they'll take turns starting with Cave Sickle 1, followed by Cave Sickle 2, and so on. Alright, we saved the easiest one for last, the passive section. This section simply details passive abilities associated with an intelligent combatant card. They function using the passive condition tag rules, meaning that they are always in effect. Make sure you don't forget these, as many combatants rely on them heavily. Before we wrap this video up, let's touch on a couple details about how intelligent combatants act. We're going to take a quick look at targeting priority, up to versus within, and the 3 golden rules. Let's start with targeting priority. Sometimes an AI step will specify who the intelligent combatant will attack, such as the adventure with the lowest hit points or something along those lines. Other times it won't even say. Regardless, if it doesn't say or if there's a tie, an intelligent combatant will always attack the adventurer who is nearest to the front of the initiative track. In this way, our initiative track also acts as our tiebreaker. Next up, let's define what up to means versus within. If the instructions on an intelligent combatant card specifies up to, it means that the combatant will attempt to use the maximum value if able. If an intelligent combatant's card says within, then the combatant will use the action or ability without consideration to maximum ranges or values. So, for example, the Animate's intelligent combatant card says, move up to 2 spaces farther from the target. This means the Animate will always move 2 spaces further from the target unless they cannot. In this case, they'd move as far as they could. If instead the Animate card said to move within 4 spaces, using within instead of up to, then the animate would find the nearest opponent. If that opponent was already 3 or fewer spaces away, then the animate would not move at all. The last thing we'll mention is the 3 golden rules of intelligent combatant cards. First, multiple choices. While we've worked as hard as possible to make it not happen, sometimes a combatant might have more than one option available to them. This might be when determining which ability to use or how to spend symbols. In all cases, if there are 2 options, players should always choose the option that is deemed the most detrimental to the players. After all, the intelligent combatants are working against you. The second golden rule is hurting themselves. Sometimes a combatant's AI step will instruct them to do something that might hurt or defeat them, such as jumping over dangerous terrain or provoking break attacks. They will take all actions as written on their combatant card, even if it may hurt them. However, if they can still complete the instructions as written without the risk of hurting themselves, they will take the less risky path. This would include such things as moving around dangerous terrain if they can still reach their target destination while doing so. The third golden rule is titled Defeating Themselves. Unless otherwise stated, a combatant will never make an action or use an ability that would result in their guaranteed defeat. This includes ending their turn in dangerous terrain or moving into a position where a current or special encounter rule would defeat them at the end of their turn. This will sometimes cause the combatant to do nothing on their turn. Okay, that's it. Thanks for watching this video. We'll see you next time when we go over other rules and variants.